So Japan just refused to sign a UN treaty that bans all nuclear weapons, as if that's possible. Now, this is not surprising at all. It's not surprising in the least. Why? Because Japan did this sort of refusal back in the year 2013, the year 2013. In Switzerland, in Geneva to be specific. The people up in Switzerland said, hey, everyone should sign this treaty that bans the proliferation of nuclear weapons and the production of nuclear weapons. And Japan, you should sign it too. Yes, Japan, you are the only victim in the world of nuclear weapons. You were nuked. You're the only country in history that's actually been nuked. You should sign this. Sign it, Japan. And Japan is like, we're one of the most warlike countries on earth. Why the hell do we want to sign this thing? So this is not shocking at all. Japan wants to have nuclear weapons. Japan is... People are going to get mad because they're going to say, well, you're making generalizations. But I'm going to be making a lot of generalizations here. Japan still wants to be militaristic. There is still a tremendous amount of nationalism in Japan. Hell, even all these right-wing lunatics in the United States and in Europe, they praise Japan. The country that gets the most praise from the right wing is Japan. That and Israel also. Apparently all the people who hate Jews also love Israel, which is kind of ironic. But, you know, a lot of these right-wing lunatics, they love Japan because, oh, Japan is still nationalistic and traditional and all that stuff. There's still a tremendous amount of national pride in Japan. The fact that people like Shinzo Abe has been popular for so many years in politics in Japan. That is an indication of this strong nationalist sentiment in that country. Shinzo Abe, he resigned from his position as Prime Minister of Japan, but he himself said, whoever's going to take my position is going to pursue the reformation of Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution. And what that meant was, hey, it doesn't matter if I leave, whoever becomes the Prime Minister of Japan is going to be doing the same sort of policy that I've been doing, which is pretty much getting rid of the prohibition imposed on Japan against the participation in warfare. And this has been the status quo for Japan since the end of the Second World War. Japan is essentially a territory of the American Empire. It's been this way since the end of the Second World War, and rightfully so, because Japan lost. Japan tried to overthrow American power. Japan tried to really eclipse the American Empire. And Japan wanted to establish itself as the power in Asia, in East Asia, North and Southeast Asia. And the American Empire wasn't going to allow that. It wasn't going to tolerate that, and rightfully so. Thank God Japan lost, because Japan was a genocidal, absolutely evil, satanic empire that butchered millions upon millions of people in China, in Korea, in the Philippines, in other parts of Asia. Japan was an absolutely evil, evil empire that needed to be overthrown. And yes, I absolutely agree with the nuking of Japan. It was a necessary thing to do. And so Japan lost the war, and America said, you're going to be a territory of the American Empire, and we are not going to allow you to participate in war or to pursue establishing yourself as a global military power. We're not going to allow this to happen again. Well, that policy got essentially thrown out the window once General MacArthur lost the presidential race. MacArthur really was the only thing standing in between the American Cold Warriors and the Japanese militarists. And the American Cold Warriors wanted to collaborate with the Japanese militarists because they wanted to use Japan as a weapon against the Chinese. Again, the Chinese, were communist. We have to use Japan as an American satellite country against the Chinese and ultimately against the Soviet Union. Now, General MacArthur, being a guy who defeated the Japanese, he didn't want that sort of policy to be done. He wanted to keep Japan subdued, and understandably so. Once General MacArthur lost in his attempt to become the president, he was essentially pushed aside, and the Cold Warriors took over the department regarding American foreign policy towards Japan. And the CIA essentially created a nationalist party in Japan called the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party. Now, the reason for this was because they were actually moderates who were ruling the Japanese government, and they entertained the idea of bettering trade between Japan and China. They entertained the idea of bettering relations between the Japanese and the Chinese. The Cold Warriors, the American militarists, they didn't like this at all. These were the same types of people who supported Operation Paperclip. These are the same types of people who supported the idea of giving six-digit figure salary jobs to Nazi SS officers in the United States. These American militarists were essentially fascist. These were the same types of people who supported Operation Gladio, in which NATO, especially the United States and Britain, armed, trained, and backed Nazi and nationalist paramilitaries in Europe. These people were absolutely evil and sick. Grandiose ideas about, the American Empire dominating the Soviet Union, grandiose ideas of becoming very, very powerful and influential really fueled these people's actions. And the CIA financed and backed the creation of the LDP. The LDP has been the most dominating party in Japanese politics ever since. The CIA supported the Japanese nationalists just like the CIA supported the Taliban. It was all about guaranteeing American power and using these types of groups as American proxies. And so the Japanese nationalists are just that. They're American proxies. But what happened with the Taliban? The Taliban was an American proxy. The Taliban, though, got out of control. The Taliban started as the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen were being backed by the CIA. The Mujahideen spread their ideology all over the place. They spread their presence all over the place. They went all throughout Asia. They spread within Central Asia. They went all the way to Europe. They went all over the place in the Middle East. And they essentially created a problem that was very difficult for the Americans to control. And the Americans are still having problems with this. And I think that this sort of thing is going to happen with America's Frankenstein in Japan. The Americans financed the creation of the LDP. The Americans wanted nationalism to rule in Japan. And these nationalists were militarists, and they still are. The first leader or the first president of the LDP within Japan was Yoshihide Kishi. And not Yoshihide, sorry, Nobusuke Kishi. Nobusuke Kishi was the grandfather of Shinzo Abe. And Kishi was also a war criminal. And he was backed by the CIA. His party was financed by the CIA. His campaign was financed by the CIA. And the money that was used all came from all of that gold that Japan was hoarding. After the Second World War, the Americans took all of that gold and they made a fund with it, a fund by which to finance Japanese nationalism. Just like the Americans wanted nationalism in Europe through the Gladio operation of NATO. And so the Japanese nationalists dominated Japanese politics, and they still dominate Japanese politics. And you have now Yoshihide Suga, who is Shinzo Abe's successor, and he is pursuing the same sort of policy that his predecessor did, which is really removing Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution. After the Second World War, the Americans said, we want to make sure that Japan never rises again as a military threat, so they put in this article within Japan's constitution. Now, Japan's constitution really isn't Japan's constitution. Any serious Japanese nationalist, or really any sort of serious Japanese historian on post-war Japan will tell you this. It was the Americans who dictated the entire thing. The Japanese constitution is the constitution for the Japanese territory of the United States. And Article 9 essentially says that Japan is prohibited from participating in war in any sort of form or capacity. The Japanese nationalists want to remove this. The militarists who have been controlling Japan want to remove this. Kishi the grandfather of Shinzo Abe, who served as the prime minister, whose election victory was financed by the CIA, Kishi wanted to reform Article 9. And his grandson continued on in the same sort of political aspiration. Now, Shinzo Abe's successor, Suga, is doing the same exact thing. In fact, before Shinzo Abe left before he left the office of prime minister, he said that whoever takes my place is going to pursue reforming Article 9. By reform, they mean essentially getting rid of. Because Article 9 is quite clear. Japan cannot get involved in war. Once the Cold Warriors began to dictate American foreign policy in regards to Japan, that all began to change. Now Japan is one of the most substantial military powers in the world. It has a navy that's actually bigger than the British Navy. That's not supposed to be there. It's not supposed to be like that. But it is. Why? Because America, just like it did with the Mujahideen, is backing Japanese militarism. And just like what happened with the Mujahideen, in the end, the United States is going to be faced with a Japanese problem. It's going to be a problem that is going to be very difficult to control for the Americans, because they're going to end up facing a threat to American hegemony in Asia. Japan wants to control the seas in Northeast Asia. Well, that's impossible if America is in the way, because America controls the seas. No empire in history has controlled the seas like the United States does today. And so in order for Japan to become the superpower of Asia, it has to remove American power. It has to get rid of it. It has to cancel it out. So Japan is going to eventually come to the point where it's going to confront the Americans. And America is going to have to deal with that, because Japan wants to become militarily independent. The Americans know this, by the way. There's actually a document that you can read. It's from the year 2008. It's from the Committee on Foreign Relations, which is a part of the U.S. Senate, the American Senate. And in this document, it basically says that if Japan ever gets the perception that America no longer is concerned with its national security, with Japanese security, the Japanese will pursue nuclear weapons. And it even states that Japan has the capacity to creating nuclear weapons within a matter of months. And the same document actually says the same thing about the Germans. You have to understand, we are still in this global phenomena of nationalism. And people say, well, Trump is an emblem of this global phenomena. And it's true. Trump is sort of this image of the phenomena that we're seeing today, that we have been seeing in the last 5 years. But this phenomena began before Trump. And it began before the rise of all these right-wing groups and political parties that we saw in Europe. It began in Asia. See, people forget this. This nationalist phenomena, it began in Asia. We saw this in 2014 with the rise of Mahdi. We saw this with the rise of Sutaro in the Philippines. We saw this, Rodrigo Sutaro, I think his name is. We saw this also with the rise of Shinzo Abe in Japan. This sort of thing was going on for a very long time. It started in the East, and it spread into the West. And that's what we're seeing right now. Now, Trump has gained the reputation of being this image of this global phenomena. And what happened with Trump? Trump said, America first. Why are we helping the Europeans? And Trump implied essentially the same thing in regards to the Japanese. Remember what he said when he was campaigning. He said, hey, if the Japanese want to nuke North Korea, then so be it. America is becoming more and more isolationist. And this global phenomena of nationalism, it's almost everywhere. It's like a cancer. We're seeing this in Belarus. The Belarusians want to overthrow Lukashenko, and the guy's been ruling Belarus since the early 1990s. It's like, You hate this guy now. He's been ruling your country for decades. Now all of a sudden they want to overthrow him. And I just smell a NATO operation in that country. And in fact, I saw some Belarusian activists, and they had a picture of this woman, and she's wearing white and red. And then also on her Instagram account, she had a picture of a red square, and she said, you know, every Belarusian should wear red. It's the color of the blood of our ancestors. And so this whole nationalist phenomena, this fixation on ancestry, this fixation on tribe, this phenomena of racial pride, and this fixation on racial identity, all of these things are a symptom of this global resurgence in nationalism. And it's the same sort of thing that we saw before the spark of World War I, the spark of that commenced the Second World War. It leads to bloodshed. It leads to bloodshed. There's still a lot of national tensions in Northeast Asia. There's a lot of wounds that have never been healed. The fact that Japan, I don't want to sound like I'm generalizing, the fact that so many Japanese politicians refuse to admit that the massacre of Nanking took place. The fact that Shinzo Abe himself has denied the massacre of Nanking. The fact that Shinzo Abe himself said there were no comfort women, Chinese sex slaves, Korean sex slaves for the Japanese imperial military. All these things tell me that all of the hatreds of the past, all of the hatreds that we assume in our own delusion of modernity, this idea that all these hatreds are gone, this delusion that all these hatreds are gone, it really shows me that it's all just delusion. The hatreds are still there. And all it takes is a spark. All it's going to take is a spark, and that may be done through something that the Chinese will do, or it could be something that the North Koreans will do, or it could be just a false flag attack that the Japanese will create in order to make a pretext to start a war. Or it could be a situation that could happen in Northeast Asia, in the Far East, that Japan could capitalize on. And from there you could have a war. We saw that sort of thing during the Boxer Rebellion. There was a politician, a Japanese politician who was beheaded by Chinese Muslims, and the Japanese put their military in China, and eventually the Japanese military presence in China sparked a war between the Japanese and the Russians in 1904. The fact that the Japanese still want nuclear weapons, the fact that the Japanese want to be militarily independent, the fact that so much tension is still there between countries like Japan and China, Japan and North and South Korea, tells me that war is inevitable. In fact, you know, if there is one country that North Korea hates more than any other country, it's Japan. We assume that the North Koreans hate the Americans more than anyone else. No, the North Koreans hate the Japanese. And if there was one thing that could unite North and South Korea, it would be their hatred for Japan. Because the Japanese genocided the Koreans during the Second World War. So yeah, those are my thoughts on this subject. Hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Hope you guys have learned something from this video. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.